Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Energy MD podcast, where we're on a mission to help a million people increase their energy naturally, decrease their chronic fatigue, their long COVID, their mast cell activation syndrome, so they can have more fun and more success in every aspect of their lives. And so, part of this process, we're always looking at the mental, the emotional, and the physical. And part of this process really is about working on the mental and the emotional. And so one of the things that we talk about in our program, we've got an expert on today, is joy, increasing the amount of fun that you have in your life. So I'm really excited to be talking with my friend Carolyn Zwickson today. So let's learn a little bit about her. So she is a certified health coach and joy mentor with a background in counseling psychology. She is on a mission to reframe how we think about and cultivate joy in our lives because she has found that when joy is actively pursued and begins to play a central role in people's lives, everything ranging from careers to relationship to health works better. I couldn't agree more. Authentic joy is the key to creating a life you can thrive in. Caroline is the creator of Easy Joy, a simple 28-day challenge that guides you through simple daily joy rituals. I highly recommend you go check that out on her website. And she is also the host of her own podcast, Joy Class, where she interviews inspiring thinkers and top experts on how to unlock and access joy consistently. Caroline is also a mom to three amazing kids, two boys and a girl, a wife, a lover of nature and food, as well as a hobby painter, currently working on a series called Energy Portraits. She grew up in Europe, but now lives in the East Coast of the US with her family. Caroline, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to be talking about increasing or up your joy, increase your energy. I love that title.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about joy. Let's talk about how you got into this a little bit. Why joy? What was it that what was a little bit of your path that brought you into specializing in joy?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, my background is in counseling psychology, and I actually wrote my master thesis on how women specifically experience different emotions in their body and how we can use that awareness of specifically fear, anger, sadness, and joy in our body in order to create more wholeness and heal the parts of our lives that are causing us pain and upping the feelings that bring us joy and pleasure. And so when I think about it now, didn't always have this connection to joy, but when I think about it now, it's really always been something that I've been passionate about for 10 plus years and that I've always had a focus on. And then specifically with my practice, I've had a coaching practice for over 10 years. And what I saw and what I really observed is that when joy was absent in people's lives, people started to burn out. Their relationships didn't work. Their health and well-being started to become brittle. And so for me, when I looked at people whose lives were thriving, who had a healthy sense of optimism, who were resilient, all of those people had active joy in their life. And
Mhm.
for people who were struggling, joy was oftentimes missing and lacking. And so I had this sort of like big aha moment during the pandemic when joy was starting to be scarce in my own life. And I had this super joyful experience one morning, very randomly. It was a spring morning, and I went on a walk, and I felt really stressed out and overwhelmed with three little kids during the pandemic. And I was on my outdoor walk in the morning, and I looked up, and there were all these blooming flowers just around me, like one of those beautiful pink trees. And I was just engulfed in this beauty. And I had such joy coming into me. And then what happened is that my whole day was better. I had a great conversation. I was so much more patient with my kids, first of all. Had a great conversation with my husband. Like I just felt more buoyant in my own life. And I remember sitting down that evening and being like, it's joy. Like this is what joy does to us. It makes us more buoyant. It makes us more resilient. It brings us a sense of optimism and positivity into our life that allows us to do everything in our life better. And so that's when I really started to nail down this focus on joy. That's when I had the idea for starting a Joy Class podcast. That's when I started to work on my 28-day joy challenge to really help people see that joy doesn't have to be complicated, but that it can really be so easy with these subtle, small things that we can practice on a daily basis that really open up our joy channels. Because when you start to see the small joy stuff in your life that's always available, the bigger joy experiences are actually going to come to you more easily too.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's how I got into the joy world, I guess.
Excellent. So why isn't this more intuitive for us? Why aren't we just constantly living our lives full of joy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on in our society specifically. I think that we live in a society that's pretty obsessed with productivity and really driven by these perfectionistic principles and ideals. And I think that that is really keeping people in a hamster wheel where they value accomplishing things, checking off lists, and they tell themselves that the joy is going to come at the end of it. Like when they've
Mm,
done all the tasks, when they've finished all the to dos, then they're going to have a sense of joy, or they think that it's going to be the big vacation or the big trip that's going to be joyful, but they don't think of joy as a tool. And so that's what I really want to reframe. And I say, like, I want to reframe how we see joy or how we think about joy, is I really want people to understand that it's not just the reward at the end. Joy is actually your most powerful tool. So if you have active joy in your life, everything else is going to be so much easier. So I think that's the first one. But I think in our society in general, we are so caught up in these productive and perfect ideals and standards that sometimes for us it's really, really difficult to tap into the effortlessness of joy, you know?
mm,
Um, and then I also think that joy runs in families. And I don't mean the genetics of people necessarily, but I think that if you are brought up by a parent who actively has joy in their life and role models to you what it's like to, at the end of the day, put the work to the side and have just a joyful dinner together, and they maybe make the dinner table really beautiful and take such joy in preparing things with intention and care. I think that for people who are raised by parents like that, it's much easier to make space for joy for them too. So that's why I say I think joy runs in families. And I think the same is true for optimism too. And Martin Seligman actually did a really interesting study, or he's the founder of happiness, basically. The I forget what his institute is called right now, but he essentially looked into optimism, and that people are optimistic if their primary caretaker was optimistic, because they
mm,
explain the world to them through the eyes of an optimistic person. And so that's how we adopt optimism. And I think joy works similarly to optimism in that way, where if you've been role modeled from a very young age what it's like to have joy in your life, what it's like to make space for the things that you like, that bring you joy, that make you happy. It's going to be so much more intuitive for you too. So I think some of it is generational too, and I think it's really important for people to look into that. What were my parents role modeling to me when it comes to how I spend my energy?
mhm,
you know I
mm,
think is a really important question. And then I think we're also misled by big marketing companies that are trying to sell us things, and that like tell us that the joy is in the big vacation, the big expensive time consuming things that are material. And we sometimes miss that joy is actually available to all of us at any time. It doesn't matter if you're going through an easy time or a hard time in your life. You can have small moments of joy all the time if you're looking. And I call that opening up your joy channels, by really starting to notice the small and the subtle things that are completely free.
mm.
So, yeah,
So good.
I
And
think
so it
that's why
sounds
it's
like
not intuitive.
what's that?
I think that's why it's not intuitive, because
Right.
there's so many different blocks.
Mhm. There's lots of messages that we're getting that are not necessarily allowing us to foster joy. So it seemed like you were saying like perfectionism and productivity are kind of the antithesis to joy, or at least they make it harder if we're focused. I mean, I guess if you're focused on anything too much, right, and not focused on this thing over here. Um, but it seems like they're the antithesis to joy. Is that
Yeah.
accurate?
Yeah, stress is. And I think
Hmm.
that productivity and perfectionism fuel our stress immensely.
Hmm. So
Hmm.
then So then how do you start creating, or how does one start creating more joy in their lives?
Hmm. So I've outlined 5 specific joy blockers that I've seen, and I think sometimes being aware of those can be a really helpful start because we can try to pull all the joy in that we want, but if there's these unconscious currents and unconscious patterns that are keeping us from experiencing joy effortlessly, I think it's going to be hard to make the joy that you're trying to pull in stick. And so
Mhm.
the 5 joy blockers that I talk about is unaddressed or lingering health issues, right? Like if you have raging migraines and you are doing nothing to try to address them, it's going to be hard on a really bad migraine day for you to have joy, you know? And
Mhm.
depending on how often you get them, the more debilitating they can become. So, unaddressed and lingering health issues, unaddressed and lingering relationship issues. I think this is a
Mhm.
huge one. I think so many people are in relationships where they aren't able to fully express who they are. They don't have a sense of independence in the relationship. So a lot of my work surrounds both health and relationships and trying to align those 2 aspects of our lives in a way that creates openness for more joy. So I think those 2 are really big ones. Unconscious beliefs and expectations that are keeping us stuck in stress and overwhelm. A lot of times the overarching underneath or unconscious belief is I'm not enough. So if you never think that you're enough, you're going to be in that hamster wheel forever,
Mhm.
you know? And so I think really starting to untangle what are these unconscious beliefs? What are these unconscious and quiet messages that I'm constantly sending to myself that are keeping me from actually putting down the to-do list and enjoying my life, you know? And then another one is that a lot of people have never actually taken the time to understand what brings them joy, right? Like I talk a lot with my clients about energy fuelers and energy drainers. If I ask somebody what's draining your energy, you will not believe how easy it is for people to answer this question. It's so easy to rattle off like 100 things that are draining your energy that feel exhausting. And when I ask people what's fueling your energy, you wouldn't believe how difficult it actually is for people to answer that question. And then some people, even if they can answer those questions, when you ask them how often they actually engage in those, it is so minuscule, you know?
Mhm.
And so that clearly the balance of our energy drainers and our energy fuelers is completely off. And I think that's again like where like a joy practice comes in, because sometimes it's easier to ask people what brings you joy than what fuels your energy, you know? And
Mhm.
so this is a really big joy blocker that people have never actually sat down and asked themselves, what brings me joy in this season of my life? Because some
Mhm.
people can say, oh, when I was 20 and had no responsibilities other than like going to my day job, but I didn't have family yet or parents to take care of or whatever the stressors are, that joy doesn't necessarily apply to the life that you have today, you know? And so I think it's really important to sit down by yourself or with someone who you really trust periodically and ask yourself, how am I changing? How have I evolved? What actually feels really joyful for me in this season of my life that is doable, that it's not, you know, that's maybe not the vacation to, I don't know, Bora Bora or somewhere that's, you know, a once in a lifetime kind of unrealistic consistent joy fueler to have. So this is, I think, a really important piece for people to do, and that I think happens a lot. It's a big conversation in coaching and coaching sessions too. Is like really helping people pull back the layers, because it's easy. A lot of times, what I see too is that people tell you all the things that they think should bring them joy, right? But like really, like you really got to sit down and ask yourself, like, what actually brings me joy? Like the person that I am, not the neighbor,
Uh-huh.
you know? Um, and then the last one, the last joy blocker, and this one I think is the most complex one, is that joy is really vulnerable. And for people who've had a lot of trauma, for example, it's sometimes really difficult to allow themselves to feel joy because it's also such a vulnerable emotion. And
Mhm.
so I think if someone resonates with this last joy blocker, having a really good therapist, having a really good support system where they can really work through their trauma and loosening up the tightness that they feel of having to keep it together, I think is really important in order to soften up a little bit where joy can kind of flow more freely.
Mhm. It seems like in that case you'd have to kind of dip your toe into joy a little bit with
Mhm.
somebody's guidance, and kind of work up to it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And then, so these five joy blockers, I think just assessing that for yourself, and you don't have to address all of them at the same time. Like, allow yourself to take time. Do one at a time. It's okay if this takes a little bit of time and effort, and yeah, if it just takes a little bit of time. I think sometimes we're in such a rush that, like, if it doesn't work right now immediately, it's not for me. But I think this is, again, like, not serving us. That's not how joy works. That's not how true happiness works in our lives. Like, take it one at a time. So these joy blockers, I think, can be helpful in identifying where you might be getting stuck. And then otherwise, like, you really start to bring awareness to these small things that you can do consistently. I always say small and consistent is better than rare and big. And so really starting to sit yourself down and asking yourself, like, what do I like? What are the things that I am curious about? What are the things that I would like to try out? And even if it's just that you can try them out once a week. I think sometimes, again, like, going back to this, like, perfectionism, people, like, I had a client recently who said, oh, I've always been curious about Pilates. I hear great things about it. I feel like it would be a really fun thing for me to do. And I'm like, okay, like, let's try it. And she's like, yeah, but I just don't think I can figure out a way to do it 3 times a week. And I'm like, can you do it 1 time a week? But I think in our society, we're so perfectionistically driven that unless we can figure out how we can basically turn it into an Olympic sport, it's not going to be worth it at all. And so I really want to encourage people out there to just follow their instincts. And even if you can just do something once in a while, if it brings you joy and you like it and it feels good, just do it. Just give yourself permission to do things not in a competitive way or not
Mhm.
in a perfectionistic way.
Yeah, and I think we're notoriously bad at managing our days, and as our responsibilities have increased since we were 20, right? Then all
Hmm.
of a sudden, and we've got work time, and then we have family time, and then you run out of hours, and so there's no you time necessarily, let alone fun time or joy
Hmm.
time, right? And so,
Hmm.
what do you feel like is ideal um, for the amount of time that should be spent in joy per day, per week? What do you think?
I mean, as much as possible. I think that we can also combine things. Like, it's not like, oh, now I'm at work. It's not my joy time. I'm at work, or I'm with my family attending to my kids. Now it's not the joy time. You don't have to put your joy on a pedestal or think that it has to be this complicated thing that you have to carve out a lot of time for. If you, for example, if being outside gives you joy, maybe you don't have to wait for the 1 hour walk that you can go on by yourself in a forest far away, but maybe you can take your kids out into the garden for 20 minutes or 15 minutes at the end of the day to just run around and put your feet on the ground. So, like, be a little bit more open-minded, take it a little easier. Like, it doesn't have to be this perfect joy experience that you dream up on a Saturday morning that you're trying to live up to perfectly 5 times a week. I think allow yourself to be a little bit flexible and creative with how you're approaching having a joy practice, where even if it's 5 minutes and you go around the block one time, that's also better than nothing.
Right.
But then instead of, walking around a block resentful that you didn't get the 1 hour walk, really try to enjoy the 5 minutes that you got. I think, again, like, this goes back to, like, the perfectionism that we live in. And I think, and you will probably be familiar with this, but I think out in the wellness world in general, sometimes people are really exhausted from trying to keep up with their wellness routine or with eating the right way or getting all the exercise that they think they should. Or people get really stressed out when they slept 6.5 hours one night instead of the perfect 8. And then the stress that they experience because they didn't sleep the full 8 hours actually ruins their day much more than the 1.5 hours of sleep they missed out on. So I
Right.
think it just be a little bit easier with yourself, a little bit kinder, a little bit softer. And I think that's where joy can really start to grow roots. You're making
Hmm.
your soil more fertile, more airy than, like, it's really dense and hard all the time.
Hmm. That's so
So,
good. I think it's interesting because, I know for me, in order for me to be successful in life, I have to schedule it on my calendar. I have to make sure that there's time. I have to, and that's kind
mhm,
of my awareness in knowing. And for me, it's singing. Like when I sing, that's really my joy place. And so
mhm,
so if I schedule it, And I know in that time it's going to happen, but yet that's also kind of my perfectionism productivity, but it also allows me to make sure that my day is not just filled with tasks, but that
Yeah.
the things that are important to me, I are, this time is for mindset, this time is for singing, this time is for connecting with family, this time is for
Yeah.
listening to sports commentary. So I have a number of these things kind of built into my life, even though it still seems a little bit regimented. It allows me to then experience those joy things. But it sounds like it's a little bit of a push and pull.
Yeah, but and I also love what you're doing. I'm not against the scheduling it in and carving out specific time for it. Like I love that you're doing that. It's so great. I really like it. But I think sometimes like sometimes life happens and the things that you do for fun or for yourself are a lot of times the things that go out the window first. So what I'm
Hmm.
saying is like don't reserve joy for a time period of your day. Like, see if you can find ways to weave it in throughout and everywhere, you
Hmm.
know? And then, of course, like, for example, one example from my own life is one of the biggest things that gives me joy that I realized when I really sat myself down and said, okay, Caroline, what really gives you joy? One of the biggest things that came up for me is one on one time. I love being with all of my kids at the same time, but it's also kind of stressful and overwhelming. And but what really fuels me up with energy and what fills me up with so much joy is when I get one-on-one time with each of them. But like you said, like that requires that I plan who's going to
Hmm.
take the other two. Like what time am I going to take just one of them on a little lunch date or on a little hike or something like that? Like that requires planning. And so I'm all for that to carve out these like these time periods in your life that are really dedicated to something that brings you joy. I think that's also really important and really really wonderful too.
Hmm.
So
Nice. Yeah, I
yeah.
think yeah, I've been noticing also, like with my daughter, I've been talking to her more about like joy and fun, and because oftentimes she doesn't realize those things. Like you were saying, people have a hard time figuring out what makes them joyful, what's fun in their life. So what are some of the ways that they can do that? Is it just like when something happens you write it down, or how do people start creating that list?
hmm So one thing I've noticed, and actually through my podcast, and I wasn't aware of this before, I always ask people who come on, what brought you joy as a child and what brings you joy now?
Hmm.
And oftentimes, the things that brought us joy when we were little are the things that still bring us joy now. Like so many people have
Hmm.
said, oh, like running around in a forest, like forgetting about time and just getting lost in play with my friends. And then they say, as an adult, they still love being in nature, going swimming in the ocean, things like that. So I think sometimes asking yourself, what did you do when before you had all these rules in your mind about what joy is supposed to look like? What did you just intuitively do when you were a kid? Like were you a theater kid? Were you a sporty kid? What did you really like when you were little? I think that can sometimes be a good starting point. Um, and then like remembering moments from your life that really felt effortless and peaceful and joyful can be
Hmm.
a good way to start understanding your own things. And then even asking people like, what do you think you're just doing because you think you should? And I think when people are in the right mindset, they can actually pinpoint a lot of things that they're doing purely from an obligation perspective because they think they should and because maybe it looks good or everyone's doing it or that's how I'm going to be able to lose weight and it's also supposed to give me joy. And you can do
Hmm.
things, to lose weight that are also joyful. Like how can you start to combine these different areas of your life to infuse the things that you're already doing with more joy?
Hmm. Yeah, we have to be careful about should, otherwise we end up shoulding all over ourselves, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is so rich. So, what else would you like to make sure that we discuss that we haven't discussed so far?
Yeah. So let me think about that. That's a really good question. What have we not discussed that we should really say about joy?
I guess we can talk about, let's talk about energy and joy. because you had mentioned that before about you asked that question when people come to work with you. And so, what is that connection between joy and energy? I mean, I know you addressed it a little bit with those joy
Yeah.
blockers. Those are kind of energy blockers too, but
Yeah.
anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah. So I think the wonderful thing that happens, like having an active joy practice, is a huge energy fueler for people. Like if you think about like if you start your day with something that is truly joyful for you, you're going to have so much more energy. Like I see that through and through in my clients. They have more energy. They also, it's much easier to feel really clear on what you actually want in your life. It's much easier to start to set boundaries when you know what brings you joy and you have this sort of, in a way, it's a self care practice too, right? Having a joy practice is a self care practice. But I think the more you elevate yourself through joy in your life, like things become so intuitively so obvious, like what you want to say yes and no to, where you need to place a boundary. And all of these things give you more energy. And I think the other one that's a huge one, when people start to have more joy in their life, their outlook becomes so much more optimistic. And an optimistic mind will always have more energy than a pessimistic mind. Like if you see problems everywhere, you will be exhausted. But if you are in a more optimistic place in your life and you feel hopeful and you feel like there are solutions abounding all around you, your energy level is completely going to shift. So I think those two are really, really big and important ones that like your joy will boost your energy. And because again, it's the antithesis, like you said, to stress and overwhelm, you know? And
Mhm.
then it's also going to just completely change your outlook where you see solutions, where you become more optimistic, where you have more positive thoughts. Your relationship to yourself changes in ways that is so beautiful that I've seen in my clients over the last couple of years. Um, because you just see yourself in a new light when you're not always consumed by your to-do list and by stress and by all the
Mhm.
things that you need to get done in order to feel like you're doing a good enough job, you know?
Yeah, I'm
So,
so glad you said that, because you really shed some light on something that I've been kind of struggling with right now. For people who are going through our program, people who are having more success are more optimistic. And so I've been
mhm.
thinking about, and we have a mindset practice that we have people do in the program, but I've been trying to put my finger on what is it exactly that's keeping some of these people back. And I think you nailed it. I think that it is joy and it is
Yeah.
optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's beautiful ways in which we can learn to become more optimistic too. And I think the same, and I think again, like joy and optimism for me are always holding hands, you know? But
Mhm.
if we really want to become more optimistic, it's look at what you're making personal that isn't, look what you're making persistent that isn't, and look what you're making pervasive. So
Mm.
those three things, like if you can really start to nail those down and untangle that, like, for example, this thing that happened at work that went badly wasn't actually all my fault. Like it's not a personal thing. It's not going to impact the rest of my career forever. And it's not going to therefore now destroy my marriage and all the other things that are around. So
Mhm.
people who are pessimistic have those three trademarks. They make things personal, persistent, and pervasive. And people who have a more optimistic mindset are able to see that this event where maybe they failed doesn't mean that they're all bad, that it's going to last forever and it's going to impact all these other areas in their life.
That's so good.
So, yeah.
I want to touch on one other thing, and then we'll go ahead and have you share your information with our audience. So, one of the things that I get from looking at the five joy blockers is that it can be kind of overwhelming, right?
Hmm.
And so, one of the things that I noticed in terms of like unaddressed relationship issues that you mentioned was if you have a joy practice and you change, it's this idea of, when you're looking outside of yourself and you see things that you want to change, most of the time it means that you need to change. And you were
Hmm.
talking about setting boundaries, having more joy, essentially creating yourself the life that you want. Consequently, your relationships are going to change. And a lot of these things that are blocking, if you set those boundaries and you say, okay, this is what I am willing and not willing to do, this is where I'm in my joy, you're going to end up changing those things around you, right?
Hmm. Yeah. You mean like you're going to change your relationships with other people if
Yeah,
if
you're
you change?
naturally
Yeah.
energetically, you're naturally going to change the relationships that you have with people when you
Hmm.
change yourself for the better. Either those people
Absolutely.
will stay or they'll go. They'll get
Hmm.
there's going to be more contrast with, who you are and who they are. And so
Hmm.
consequently things are going to come to a head. You're going to be forced to have some of those conversations and either move through them or end up, getting some of the getting people out of your life who have
Hmm.
different, who are maybe more pessimistic and aren't necessarily
Hmm.
resonating at the same level that you have become.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, best case scenario, you inspire the people around you to also have more joy in their life.
Hmm.
I think that joy a lot of times can be really contagious in the best way possible, you know, where if you have more joy, you're actually giving people around you permission to engage in their joy as well. I think that's the best case scenario. And then there's other scenarios where you're going to see that some of these people who you might have in your life are actually holding you back and sucking you deeper into a state of negativity or stress or overwhelm. And then sometimes in life you make decisions where that's actually not such a great fit. And whether or not you cut those people out completely or you just distance yourself a little bit or you only share certain parts with them, that's up to you. But we're always free to adjust a boundary. It doesn't necessarily mean you just have to cut them all out, but we are free. We are in charge of the boundaries that we place in our life. But we, I think, have to be mindful and careful how we place them and how we adjust them so that we can be the best versions of ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, relationships definitely are definitely impacted when you change,
Hmm.
for sure. For sure. My
Yeah.
husband and I had both, I think, have benefited so much from really me starting this joy practice because I've asked him, like, this is what I would love to do for my joy. Like, I want to take one of my kids out for a special outing once a week. How can we make this happen? And then what do you want to do for your joy? And like, I think men sometimes don't think about it as much in these terms as women, or maybe I'm biased because I mostly work with women. But anyways, my husband doesn't think about it, but
I would
he
agree.
now does. He now does, and he's more aware of the things that he actually needs to do for himself to have these experiences and moments of joy that are lightening him up, that are allowing him to take a break from the seriousness of life and all the tasks and obligations that we're walking through every single day. And so I think in our family, bringing joy into the center of our lives has been, I think, a gift to all of us. And I can see it in my kids more too, because I don't know what your experience is with your daughter. I have three little kids, but it's so easy to overschedule them, right? Like we live in a society where they come home from school and every single day it's like, oh, this activity, now this, and now homework, and now sleep. And it's, I think it's really stressful. And so I think for us, really centering our efforts around joy in our family has allowed us to step back a little bit and say, okay, like if we are going to be really mindful around how we create our lives in this family and how we do things, and if we really have this focus on joy, what does that mean about the activities and the things that we say yes and no to, and how do we really arrange our life in a way where we have active joy in our family?
Hmm.
I think for us it's been a really beautiful way of approaching our even our schedule, our life and our schedule.
I
So
love that. That's so important. I remember my wife saying, when my daughter was like, when she was asking my daughter to kind of clean out some of the clothes that she'd outgrown, look at the piece of clothing and ask if it brings you joy. And you can do that with
Mhm.
almost everything in your life, right? And just be a lot more conscious around what we're letting in, because oftentimes we let in a whole bunch of stuff and then we're like, oh, what's going on? We're kind of swimming in it.
Exactly. Yeah. Marie Kondo method of
Uh-huh.
organizing the closet does it spark joy?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So last question. I know I said the other one was last, but this one really I think is the last.
Hmm.
Um, so you grew up in Germany. What is what is the difference between, and now you live in the States, what's the difference between joy in Germany or the thoughts around joy in Germany versus the States? Just curious.
Hmm. It's a hard question because I came to the States when I was 16.
Mm.
So I still have sort of like teenage impressions of everyday life in Germany. One thing that does always stand out to me is how in the US, like, and I run into this all the time with my American clients, is when they're struggling with something, a lot of times what they say is, I just got to stay busy. But really
Uh-huh.
what you're saying is, I just have to distract myself from feeling my real feelings. And but that being busy here is considered a good thing. But in Germany at least, and I think this is more like in maybe all of Europe, is when you tell someone like, "Oh, I've been really busy. I've been busy." Like, "How are you?" "I'm busy." That people are more like, "Oh no, what's wrong? Like, what happened that you're so busy?" That it's more like a reason for concern than, "Oh, good, you've been busy. You're good. You're busy."
Uh,
So I think that that's a big difference. And then I think in Europe there is a greater respect between work life and private life. My husband's from Europe too. He's from Sweden, and he works for a Swedish company. And he does say that there is a greater respect to, okay, well, now you got to go and take care of your family. Oh, you got to pick up your kids from school. All right, like, okay, go. That there's more of a that you don't always have to prove yourself with your busyness
mhm.
or prove your worth by how busy you are.
Right.
I think that's a big difference. Um, and then, I mean, we can talk about like food culture and all that, but people don't, in Europe, generally speaking, there's not so many people who grab and go food. Like there's more space, and I think therefore also more joy around eating and sitting down and having a proper meal versus eating really quickly on your desk, you know?
Right.
Um, so I do think joy shows up differently. And then, people have much more vacation there.
Right.
So I think like you
Mhm.
have more things to look forward to that are a little bit closer by. Like I think it makes it easier to go through a really stressful week if you know that in 2 weeks you have a vacation coming up.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's my impression is, and I could be wrong about this, but my impression is that there people have more space in their life
Mhm.
in Europe. Like we do live in a hustle culture, and I do live outside of New York, so I'm probably in the epicenter of it all. But I do think that people tend to have more space
Mhm.
um, in Europe. So
Yeah, I think that's a
yeah.
really accurate commentary on American culture and something that, like you said initially, is, these are some of the stressors that we have to be more conscious of, that we have to make different decisions about. Am I going to buy into this culture?
Mm-hmm.
Which parts am I going to keep? Which parts am I going to reject? What choices am I going to make for myself? How do I want to live my life? You know.
Yeah, yeah. I guess you asked me earlier what my overall, like my sort of, what's something that we haven't said yet, but and what I want
Mhm.
listeners to really take away from this conversation is really that you're in charge. Like it's really like this is your life. Like you get to decide what you say no to, what you say yes to. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to try on a different pattern and thing and see if that works for you. And if it doesn't work for you, it's okay. It's no big deal. Like you can try something else. Like it's not that even with like thinking about having more joy, you're allowed to try something that you think might bring you joy, and then you might try it and you find out that it actually doesn't bring you joy and you don't like it, and that's okay. And then you try something else and something new, that it doesn't have to be so strict or so driven by perfectionism, that you're allowed to kind of just dabble around and be a butterfly for a little bit of time, where you can just fly around and try out new things, and just to see where you're most drawn to. But at the ultimately, like you're in charge. You get to
Mhm.
say how you want your life to go, what you want to let into it, and what you want to keep out of it. You're in control of that.
So good.
So,
I hope
yeah.
everybody listening to this, watching this, gives themselves permission to
Mm-hmm.
do exactly as you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
So great. So you work with people in a variety of different ways, right? Can you tell us a little bit
I
about that?
do. Yeah. So we touched on this earlier. I have a 28-day journey called Easy Joy, where for 28 days, I send you one little idea for joy in the morning, and you just follow it for 28 days. And this is really meant to give you a vast variety of simple, easy, not expensive, usually just completely for free activities that you can do in order to open up your joy channels. I loved creating this challenge, and it was actually one of the challenges where so many people wrote back afterwards and said, "Oh my gosh, like this was just so wonderful to direct my attention intentionally on something that is joyful. And I think it's also good to try out a couple different things just so you have more ideas, and like can try out what actually brings you joy. So that's my challenge. And then I also do private one-on-one coaching and mentoring around joy, but really this is for people who are ready to start a new chapter, who understand that their life, the way they've been doing it, their patterns and the behaviors and the habits that they currently have are not serving them, and they're really ready to turn the page and start new and want to live life in a more joyful and aligned way. So that's what the mentorship is about. And then I also offer healing sessions, and they're basically 90-minute deep dives into a certain struggle that you have in your life, where we provide healing. And it's both like it's visualizations. We do a little bit of creative work with colors and a little bit of drawing. And also, of course, we talk. And so that's the healing sessions. And yeah, and then there's my podcast called Joy Class, which I would love for everyone to check out. And yeah, that's it. You can find me on Instagram. I post stuff there as well. So yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Yeah, and we'll drop your website link below, and then you do have a free gift for our audience. Can you tell us a
I
little bit about
do.
that?
Yes. So my free gift is it's a PDF. It's an exercise where I guide you through 6 steps that help you to create your own joy practice.
Excellent.
So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Caroline, this has been amazing. I so appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with our tribe.
Thank you so much, Evan.
I hope you learned something on today's podcast. If you did, please share it with your friends and family and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It's really helpful for getting this information out to more people who desperately need it. Sharing all the experts I know and love and the powerful tips I have is one of my absolute favorite things to do. Thanks for being part of my community. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. It is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Thanks for listening, and have an amazing day.